welcome to Conversations with Life. We have been talking about archetype this season and, taking it from different perspectives. We're looking at this fourfold nature of the soul, and we've talked about king and warrior and called those the more masculine archetypes. Again, that's not like Robert Moore's or Jung's conception of them, but that's how we conceive them, or I conceive them, And so just to kind of like sort out whose is what's and what's is whose, today we're going to talk about what I see as the more feminine half of that pair, and that's the magician and the lover. And again, when we say feminine and masculine, note that we're not talking about gender. We're talking about energy, openness, and focus,
protection and action too. Like I feel like the lover and the magician are very not defensive, but are versatile in their protection.
Yeah, it's more of a meeting of energies coming through than it is being the active principle.
Yeah.
And and so the funny thing about active principle is that everything comes from nothing, and nothing comes from everything, right? And there's this funny, play between the two. You just don't have one without the other. Alan Watts talks about you can't see anything except for it has a background. Which is more important, the atom or the background? And you can't lay a claim there. It turns out that these are there. So these are I don't want to call them passive because there's active principle in each of them, and there's a masculine and feminine even expression of each of those. But they do tend towards that. So we'll start with magician, right? And if you think of a magician in the literature, whatever, what do you think of? What comes to mind?
Well, probably most people are going to be thinking Gandalf.
Merlin.
But Merlin is like the ultimate,
Merlin
right?
Is kind of the ultimate.
I think more people in our audience today probably have encountered the Gandalf than the Merlin, but I feel like the Merlin's pretty classic wizard, magician energy.
Yeah,
and this is what you kind of feel is your dominant thing, right, Steve?
Oh yeah, I am. I have been possessed by the magician. Most of my life is pretty much can be accounted for by that. It's funny because one of the things that I've done is I've encountered myth from the time I was young. In fantasy stories, but also in myth, in religious myth, in the myths we know, like the Merlin story, which I really got into, and then literature, especially early British literature, where there's so much mythos and the Fairy Queen and Beowulf and all that. So I just have been fascinated by that because myth is kind of the structure of how energies are working. And that's the magician's job. Now, picture the magician in his tower, reading old books, coming up with this, recognizing the secret of life, not necessarily. Now, we have the black magician who's using that towards an end, and you have the kind of white magician or whatever, not to be racist or anything, but like these colors.
Yeah, I mean, you have Gandalf the white, right?
Yes.
And there's, I would even say like
black,
a sorcerer versus a magician is the way I like to hold that.
The warlock too. Like you've got, if you want to get all the terms right, you've got like the wizard, the magician, the sorcerer, and the warlock, right? And like they are, the magician and the sorcerer are the counter to each other, and the wizard and the warlock. And the wizard is the wise, like the white, the fully developed version of the magician, I guess. And so like you think of Merlin and Gandalf, and you don't really think of them as magicians so much as you think of them as wizards.
Yeah.
Right. Like they are these like wizened old, spellcasters. Right. And then I think when I think of magician, I think of like the energy of that, like the power and the euphoria and the magic of it is much more like in the forefront. And like Tolkien talks about it, where the wizard's job is to be used sparingly. The wizard solves all problems and uses big spells and is just a blanket plot removal device, right? And a magician is someone who is on the battlefield and is using magic in a fun and creative and exciting way. And so, yeah, I don't know. Maybe that has nothing to do with this, but I think of them as like almost sub-archetypes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's cool.
Well, in every archetype, there's a million sub-archetypes. So if we're going to divide, if you can think of consciousness as one thing, right? If we're going to divide it up, we can do masculine, feminine. We can do 4. We can do 10, right? We can do 2,000. And we can divide consciousness up any way you want, and it's still consciousness. And there always will be sub-iterations. Like there's always a smaller particle,
Yeah.
There's never, you'll never be able to like totally do it. But, these big ones are good to think about. And the magician sees pattern. And more importantly, the magician feels pattern. So a real magician is in harmony with nature, and they know the amount of energy that is harmonious that they can channel. Mm-hmm. So a magician channels energy. Energy is the role of channeling energy anyway. The lover is the energy. We'll talk about that. That's life force energy or whatever. These two are oddly opposite, lover and magician. We'll talk about that too. But the magician sees pattern and feels pattern, and then helps that to happen in a way that is helpful to nature.
Yeah, it feels like supports harmony. It supports nature. It might move things on a little faster, but it's not necessarily trying to control so much.
Because what the magician knows is there's a cost to power, and that's what the magician tells the king. So the king always has a magician, and the magician comes in and says, "You can't do that. You're full of shit." And the king's like, "I want to do it anyway," right? Like this classic drama between the magician and the king. And because the magician is seeing this pattern, and the king is seeing this is what I need to, this is what we need to do. This is the practical. And the magician isn't practical at all, right? Because yes. Because it's so fucking hard to get your hands on the small things when the big things, you're seeing it all, right? When you're seeing it all, the thing you're supposed to do next is a little, so Merlin, my favorite musician is Merlin in the Once and Future King. And he's living backwards. So he's coming from the future living this way, and he meets Arthur as Arthur's growing up, right? And he knows what's going to happen. And so, he's totally distracted and totally ridiculous. And at the same time, has this whole picture of things. And, Arthur is constantly like, come on, why do we have to do that? Why do we have to do that? Why do we have to do that? And what he does with Arthur, it's so beautiful in that story, is he takes them into being all these different parts of nature. He's a fish. He gets to experience himself as rocks, which is one of my favorite passages of all time in that. And it's so beautiful. He sees things from the perspective of rocks, and everything's happening. So humans are just, flipping by, and he sees things from the perspective of, all these different like natural phenomenon and creatures. And it tunes Arthur into the right use of power. Right. And because that's the signature that the magician holds, ultimately seeing one and then tuning power into its harmonious use. And on the other side, you have the sorcerer who's willing to use all the means and usually creates death in in taking power out of context.
It's a corruption.
Yeah.
I mean, almost always the sorcerer is the one who corrupts the magic and corrupts the world and nature. And you see it where like around them is death, like they walk in a shadow of death. They're dark figures. And the magician's dark anyway in their tower, playing with good and evil, understanding, they're looking at the pattern. They're not trying to take one side. I look at say like Doctor Strange, for example, right? I'm gonna go modern. He is the warrior magician.
Yeah.
Right. Where, and guided by a king, I guess, of his own moral compass, because he deviates from, those that he's in tutelage of, who believe in no interference, and goes and plays an active role in the side of good. And it's like, he's a combination of those three archetypes in a really interesting way that I think, we don't see as much in like older literature. They're more separate and more distinct.
Totally. Yeah, I think one of the ways we get played by magician is in that idea of feeling special because we encounter that numinous or that energy that seems to operate a little bit out of the ordinary reality, and assume that automatically has a blessing. And so, I've experienced, in myself and in the church and other things where it's like, oh, if somebody has a quote spiritual gift, there's like an assumption that there's morality or goodness or favor there. And it's really easy to get played by, oh, here's this person who can like read my energy or can tell me about my past lives or can, and it's real stuff. Like you can encounter some really crazy stuff in this energy world, but it's not always for your best interest, and often isn't.
Because one of the shadows or the distortions here is that the wizard or the magician gets stuck in the knowledge and stops living life. So they can shut themselves entirely away from the lover, for instance. They can cut themselves off from the blessing, and nothing gets done because they're spinning in their knowledge, and they're like, "Look at all the stuff I know. Look at all the stuff I know,"
and then paralyzed in action too.
and they just get fascinated in this thing, and when you're in that kind of current, you can get caught in, and that becomes your world, your little study up in your tower where you're just playing with all the forces and seeing them come and go, and you get into that, so historians and scientists or whatever can get stuck in this kind of magician energy of knowing for knowing's sake rather than knowing to meet the needs of the whole, right? To somehow work yourself into this mix of life,
Yeah, and when you do start to integrate that energy, it is really fun. And I could even say like this might be where like our intuition comes from.
Yeah.
So one of the places I noticed this was in the kitchen. Like for so many years, I did this whole meal plan and I cooked the same things and I followed the recipes. And all of a sudden, now when I cook, I hardly ever use a recipe. And I literally can feel in my body when I've put the right amount of something in. Like I don't have to play around. I don't have to taste it. And I may have never made the recipe before. I just open my fridge. Here's the ingredients. I know exactly how they're going to work together and how much of each.
Which is a huge, like if you go to the wizard, right? I mean, that's a huge thing. So like if you want to go like D&D, because I love that world, right? The difference between a wizard and a magician is, or a sorcerer, for example, is a sorcerer is bestowed his power and a wizard learns his power.
Interesting.
Right? And so you learn your spells. It's a seeking of knowledge that you then can apply. And so that to me is what you're describing. Like you're given power, you're given a recipe and you can make a meal. But there comes to a point where you are the recipe, you are the spell book, the things, and so you can just make off the cuff, right? And I think sometimes we get so stuck in the pursuit of that knowledge that we then, like you said, fail to act. And so that's, I guess, one of the many traps of the magician archetype is not acting. One of them is the corruption of that action for your own gain. And so, like,
because there's enormous power in it.
Yeah, and when we talk about application of an archetype, this is to me one of the best examples of what happens if you let yourself get played in an archetype. We talked about it for the warrior last episode, but for me, it's the magician. Because the lover, I don't know very much about yet, but the magician is the one that is paralyzed by into inaction when they overinvest in their ability or their status or their identity.
Yeah, it narrows you. into that kind of world. Here's another thing about the magician is nobody likes the magician. One of my favorite magicians in literature is thank you is Piggy. Piggy in the Lord of the Flies. So actually, Ralph is the king. Ralph is the king. Jack is the warrior. Piggy's the magician, and Simon's the lover.
Sure.
And Piggy's an interesting magician because he just knows a lot of things and he knows what's going on. He can see the whole thing. If it was up to him, the thing would get solved. The kids got rescued right off, he knows. But they look at him and he's just stupid fat kid that nobody likes that can't see, and has no ability to offer other than that he knows things. So that they're like, nah, nobody likes
just
him.
Dismiss.
They steal his glasses to get things done, but they don't really honor him. And ultimately, he's the one that loses his life.
I mean, Merlin's the same. I mean, Merlin's seen often in mythology as a crackpot, a lunatic, or an outsider, an outcast, but they want to use his power.
Yeah, and same with Gandalf. Gandalf, shows up at the kings, and they're like, "Gandalf Stormcrow, I don't like you. Why do you always bring us bad news?"
Yeah.
Nobody. The wizard guards or the magician sits there on the border between the subconscious and the conscious, and dwells in that place between life and death. And that's that's the shaman role, right? So that's an uncomfortable place for people because they don't want to know themselves that much. They only want to use the knowledge of the subconscious. They don't want to actually be their evil. And the magician is okay with seeing and being that and holding that place. When we meet those energies in ourselves, I just
thought of a really fun, very current example is Nate on Ted Lasso.
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
He starts out as a water boy, but he's been on the field the whole time, so he sees everything. Knows everything.
Knows what's going on. Yeah, that's really great.
And here comes Ted Lasso, who's kind of this king figure, gives him the blessing. He's like, rises up to being on the coaching staff, and then all of a sudden he's like, I could be famous. And you see his shadow magician come through, and it's just great. And that's right about where we are in the series. So it's really fun.
That's such good stuff.
I haven't seen it yet.
So I'm going to move on, but I want to mention that the feminine version of the magician is the creatrix. And they let through what you were saying about yourself in the kitchen is you're just feeling the right amount. See, life is just coming through you, and you're creating and literally giving birth.
Feels like the druid.
It's more of a druid, yeah. And the magician always has this kind of feminine energy of bringing through the patterns, but the feminine does that in such a different way. There's this the word creatrix. I love that word, right? It's this you're creating, but things are flowing through you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it reminds me of us working on the page for our latest offering, and I was like, can we try some different colors? And he's sitting there with me and he's trying different colors and he's like, man, you're way more picky than me. And I'm like, no, I'm actually waiting for a sensation from my body that it's right.
Yes, there you go. And the embodied womb feel of connection to all things is the creatrix, which is really valuable. And there's some really beautiful ones in literature.
So if the magician is big picture pattern stuff, to me the lover feels like the individual connection, the one-on-one, the micro, the small. And so powerful. Like to me, love is distilled power.
The lover is the sauce. The lover is so in the sauce that they can lose all other context.
I mean, you lose the world when you're in love.
Yeah.
Like, you lose everything when you're in love.
What matters if you're in love with everything, right?
Yeah.
And, the magician feels those energies coming through and identifies them, right? Like sees them and knows the way.
Analyzes and
the lover is just in it. And unapologetically, that's the thing about the lover. It's unapologetically okay with that. My friend who's the kind of lover archetype, I told him, Dave, I'm like, Dave, I'm not okay with how okay you are sometimes.
Nice.
Because the lover is just okay until they're not. And then they're so hurt.
So what's the shadow of the lover?
Woe is me,
What's the shadow of the lover?
Oh, well, the shadow lover gets to feel connected with everything and not know its boundary. So if the lover is masculine, there'll be the Don Juan who just is out there conquering in the name of so in love with everybody, and everybody's in love with Don Juan because it's hard to say no to that. To this person that's just like so in love with themselves and with everybody else that they become quite the lover in the sexual
lover
sense.
Is the whore.
In the sexual sense, yeah, or the I guess the whore where there's an indiscriminate use of that love energy, right?
Yeah.
Where it's not boundaried. So the lover has no sense of love, connection has no sense of boundary in itself, and that's wonderful. It's wonderful until it's not, right? Mm-hmm. So this is where the lover and the magician have this conflict because the magician's like, no, you got to do the spell right to get the energies into the right container so that they're safe. We're doing alchemy here, right? Mm-hmm. And the lover's like, what are you talking about? Who needs to understand anything? Love is all you need, man. And it's very hippie in the negative sense of hippie, where you just, it's true that all you need is love, but love has information in it, and you need to listen to it, right? Energy always has information in it, but the lover isn't paying attention to the information as much. This is joyful. The attuned lover is what we all want.
Right.
That's what we want. We want connection, love. We want to be in the field of love. We want to just sit in nature. I mean,
unconditional
run
love
naked
is the
through
whole
the
thing.
fields and have no shame and just be in our fucking energy that's just us and have no separation between us and anything else. Of course, right? And the experience of consciousness is that we separated ourselves from that for a reason, right? And we need to see the things. The lover doesn't. Now, if the lover doesn't seek the blessing, by the way, the lover eats itself.
See, I've seen this as like the love versus lust and like versus hunger, right? Like, so like love is giving and receiving and hunger is just taking and needing and devouring. Mm-hmm. And you can devour yourself in love. You can sacrifice yourself for love. And that's like the whole martyr and negative aspect of that. And it's so interesting. I keep thinking of things like they're parts of a body. Like the king is the brain that directs, and the warrior is the hands, and the sorcerer the like feet, and the lover the heart. And it's all kind of, without one, your body just doesn't work. Like, it doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. You can't just be the lover. Mm-hmm. You can't just be the sorcerer. Mm-hmm.
And if you're dominated by one, lovers are perpetual doormats. So when you played by a lover, that's fine. That's just fine, and they'll let themselves be used in a way, and people will use them. They're the friend that is accepting of everything, and also probably shouldn't be sometimes. Mm-hmm. Probably should stand and say, no, that doesn't serve love. And here's the question: are we serving love, or are we being played by love? And are we serving? It has a presence in it, doesn't it? There's an I there. And if the lover will lose their eye, and they'll just become a floaty, flotsam jetsam in the goo of life,
Yeah, this is probably my dominant pattern.
Mm-hmm. The lover.
I've definitely played strongly in a few other ways, but this is probably the one that I embody the most and have gotten played by the most. And I think that there is a narcissistic side to it, where you think you're so great because you love everything, and then like you were saying, it starts to eat you up, because it's like, oh, I just gave that thing that I actually needed for my own health and well-being.
Yeah, when you give more than you have.
And then what can happen is a total collapse and loss of sense of self.
You sort of dissolve into the boundarylessness of that love, and you don't even know where you end and someone else begins, right? You see that in relationships.
And for me, one of the hardest things, like I was talking about with the boundary thing, is when I first started working with boundaries, every boundary felt like an attack.
Or a limit.
Yeah, it felt very...
It's offensive to love.
It felt it felt mean. It felt cruel sometimes even.
Yeah.
Because it was like, I wouldn't...
Sorry. Go ahead. She just wants to sneak downstairs.
Good.
Sorry, go ahead, Sush. Go back to what you were saying.
It was too many seconds.
Dang it. So you were talking about the limitation. When you make a boundary, it feels cruel and harsh.
It felt cruel and harsh because one of the things that I think the lover does is experience, like, how would I want to be treated? All the time. Like, that's my measure. And then when a boundary comes up, it shocks me because it's like, I wouldn't do that.
But sometimes, and that's
I
the
wouldn't
hard
say
thing
no
is
to that.
You got to make yourself say the no in order to be able to say yes.
Yeah,
it's a hard.
So
balance.
it's been a painful process, but really worth it. To find that there is a way to be in that energy and serve love and enjoy the gifts that I have to offer without having to abandon or sacrifice myself.
Yeah.
The lover, one second. Something just fled my mind there.
To me, the lover is really like you said, connection, right? Yeah. And so when you look at the pantheons, like Aphrodite, as an example, she's like the oldest Olympian god, right? Basically a Titan. And then also one of the most volatile of the gods, right? Like she's the most chaotic next to, our more trickster gods like Hermes and stuff like that, right? Next to that, she's primordial and powerful and fucking bonkers. Yeah. Right? And so I feel like love, the lover being the opposite of the magician makes so much sense because the magician is methodical and thought out and careful and practiced. I think of the magician as Athena, right? Athena to me embodies the warrior and the magician. Yeah, she's wise and she's powerful, and she's careful and consistent and follows through. And then you've got Aphrodite, who's fucking everyone and out of this world and turning people into all sorts of shit, And so to me, the lover is not the shadow chaos, but it's the wild energy, the wild magic.
Yeah, Aphrodite famously marries Hephaestus.
Yeah.
The lame, get it done, kind of warrior, in his more practical, iteration, and has an affair with Ares.
Yeah, the shadow warrior, the mercenary,
and love and war are often connected, almost also, like I've mentioned, often in the same goddess or god. And so you have this really interesting thing where these volatile energies, from connection to violence. Violence is love. We have to love something to actually act in a way that would.
To be willing to be violent, there has to be some strong love.
You have to care, and that can come often if it goes to killing or whatever. It's often a distortion, but violence comes from love. Again, if the warrior loses contact with his lover, he's
and I would also say love is always violent because it is. There's going to be a change.
It's volatile.
Anytime I interact with another person, they're forced to change. Anytime I walk into a room, everybody there has to undergo a shift. Yeah. And so there's a violence in any kind of connection. that we often don't really see.
I think that's interesting, and also love challenges identity. You know, it challenges the way that we conceive. You know, off with his head and Kali energy, but like the goddess that loves also will you know, chop off your head when it needs to be chopped off. Right? Identity can't survive the field of love connection. You know, there's part of us that has to die there. You know? And that's a beautiful thing that people who hold this archetype really do. They challenge enmity. You know, enmity is this feeling that we have that we're separate from others, and that there's this us's and them's. You know, they challenge enmity, and that's uncomfortable for some people. There's a friend who will be friends with everybody, and you're like, you can't be friends with them. They're my enemies. And they'll be like, oh, I don't care.
I've definitely played that role many times, where I really fit into a lot of different groups, and it was weird, and they were often conflicting groups, and there was some sauce in that for me, because I was like, I can love it all.
Yeah, this has been really interesting. So I've been noticing as we've been talking that the shadow is the disconnected archetype. You know, the warrior that isn't a lover, that can't go home and doesn't fight for what they love, is the mercenary, right? And the king that's not connected to his sorcerer, who doesn't understand the vision to bless, is the shadow king. And I mean, like, it just goes all around, right? Like all of them, they're all connected in some way or another. And so that shadow of self is the disconnected self, and the shadow of self is the over-invested self.
Right. And Lord of the Flies is such a great teaching because of this. What you see is these immature archetypes that show up on this island and immediately start to distrust each other and work for their own interests against the others. And, you know, Ralph trying to like get everybody to work together, but like, and honor the different ones that are, as they're pulling apart, you know, you know, and then it doesn't go well. And if they would have all, you know, Simon loses his life, Piggy loses his life, because the feminine in this whole war does not work, doesn't work, right? And you know, the one that's communing with the trees and the one that's telling them what they need to do, that would have solved it. You know, if Ralph would have said, hey, we really need to pay attention to people, he did. Or Jack would have really said, let's pay attention to Piggy. Or, hey, Simon seems to have a seeing here, an understanding here. If they would have talked and worked out, fine, it works.
United.
If they don't see each other, especially in the political sense, Ralphs and Jacks are out there trying to fight each other. And when they don't get along, it's
tell me what those archetypes are, because I actually
Ralph is
read
king.
this book.
Ralph is king. What? Ralph is. Now you have to. It's really depressing.
I stayed away from it on purpose.
Watch the black and white film. You'll be okay.
King, he's just a natural charisma. Okay. Everybody likes him, and he just has natural authority. Jack is the choir boy who becomes the hunter and wants to hunt. And sees the main thing that they need to do is hunting, right? So natural warrior energy, and also lots of fun, right? So he's about fun. He's about making things go right and getting rescued. You know, observed by Piggy and Simon, then, you know, communing with the island. So like you have this whole interesting kerfuffle there, right? And if they would have just been together, if they just would have like come together and worked it out. But that Ralph Jack thing is really interesting. So anyway, so you see this, by the way, in all the politics. You see that, you know, that there's these Jacks that are like, do stuff, and the people who are like, well, we got to do the right things, you know.
Yeah, we've got to decide the stuff.
We got to decide. Yes,
you know,
I'm the decider.
And I would pose that probably still most of the time they're not listening to the more feminine. Probably not.
And most people who go these days with the warrior, they don't understand and see that they need to orient ourselves to cosmos and somehow, because they've lost faith in that, or they think they know it already rather than being curious. So the king, with the warrior's help, is connected to with the magician's help, is connected to cosmos.
Yeah.
And that cosmos is the imprint of the energy that's out there represented by stars as a kind of a thing that then creates the harmony, as above, so below kind of thing going on. So yeah, you see, it's right, and you're totally right. Where these relationships between these four are very dynamic, and they're very important in ourselves. If we're all magician, and we don't have our blessing, we'll spin. You know,
I mean, you'll just be frozen.
Yeah, you'll be frozen.
I mean, if you're not connected to your warrior,
warrior lover opposites, king magician are opposites, and then there's those cross.
Right. I feel like if you're a magician and you have a blessing, you still lack action. And so like it's you know, they might be more like, you might be 60% magician, and then 10 of all the rest, and an extra 10 in warrior or whatever, right? Like, math is not working at 8 o'clock, but you can't even.
Your love for energy, you're like 100%.
You can't even really just be two and be successful. I feel like in order to maximize your own potential, to really to really move and to avoid those pitfalls, you need to be consciously aware of what archetypes you're putting your energies into, what lenses you're using to see the world. And that's like where we're coming to, it feels like, with these last 3 episodes, is that awareness is so valuable, which might lead you into the trap of thinking magician, but it's not. Like, it's the awareness of each archetype. And I'm just like, I don't know the last time I stopped and thought to myself, how am I connected to this thing? Or what part does this play in the big picture on days when I just suck? On days when it's golden and everything's going, I'm looking back and I'm thinking like, okay, I'm making a whole program right now, and I'm thinking about how it's connected to other programs. I'm thinking about how it's part of the big picture of the school, and how it's going to help the micro of the teachers that I love and want to help, and how I have to act and what I have to, you know, and the blessing, and it all comes together in this like golden moment. And it happens by accident sometimes. And then I don't think we realize the amount of power we have if we can deliberately direct that and make it happen with our intention.
Yeah, and I think when you find yourself in a point of struggle or stuckness, or I've tried this thing so many times and I can't get it off the ground, it's really great to use these archetypes and be like, okay, what does this need more of? Does it need more king? Does it need more magician? Does it need more warrior? Does it need more love? And start actually calling that energy in, and or find people that are that, and spend some time with them.
True.
And notice also who's in your field and what's their dominant archetype, and how can you take in the template that they're offering you and grow and build that in yourself. So notice who you're attracted to right now in your life.
Yeah.
And is it a lot of king energy? Well, that might be a sign that your soul is going, hey, you need to work this in.
Yeah.
So hang out with these people.
Fair.
Well, then rather than project it, see, one of the problems when working these archetypes is we can project them rather than own them. So if I need warrior, I might end up at a sports game or be a radical sports fan because that I see these warriors doing this warrior thing, and it kind of fills the bucket, but doesn't.
It like helps you avoid it almost.
It helps me avoid it. Now,
It checks the box.
I love sports because I love these, these people that have disciplined themselves into this skillful set, and I can use the energy of that to find my own skillful set and action, right? Like I can use that as an example, but that's not what most people do. And most people want to put somebody in charge of them. For instance, that's like a thing. We want to give our power away to some president or king or, priest god, that then creates the safety for us rather than owning our own thing. We want to be part of the only true church on the face of the earth, rather than find what is in us that's true, and it's so easy to give it out here, and it's so destructive. Now you can use that, play that out here. I can be part of a church, right? I can be part of an organization that has truth in it, and not project it. I can meet it with that kind of attunement, right? I can not give all my power or action a responsibility for action to somebody else. And you'll find that we're constantly trying to give it away.
There's a big difference between
not do that.
Yeah, and there's a big difference between alignment and sacrifice. Right, like I can align myself with an organization, or even ally myself with them, and I can marry that, which is not me sacrificing autonomy or agency, or I guess autonomy is the best word. That's self-power. But I can find organizations and things and people and that I can align with, and that's a very different thing. That is I'm bringing myself to this rather than I'm sacrificing myself to this.
Yeah. Well, and I can also constellate all these archetypes and seek them, but I also understand that my pattern is, I would say my first two, I'm a magician lover, right? Magician lover, king warrior is my pattern, down the way. But I'm a magician lover, and sometimes my lover comes first, and sometimes my magician comes first. And I can just occupy myself in that place, right? And be okay with it. Like, let the magician roll, man, because that's what my trauma adds up to.
Fair.
And my gift, But the magician, it's weird. It will lead you, every archetype, if you really it will lead you to the others. So, for instance, as a magician, I can see the other archetypes, and I can see the patterns. I can see my weaknesses. Well, I've seen my weaknesses way before most people see them, Yeah. And I can see the different things, and then I can understand them. But if I'm a warrior, right? I want action, and then I start to see that my action is then unattuned, and I wonder why it's not working. I'm out there doing it all the time, but I'm never really getting anywhere. Oh, maybe it's because don't know what I'm fighting for. Maybe it's because I don't have the strategy that the magician could bring. Right?
Maybe it's I'm not in love with the thing I'm fighting for.
Because I'm not in love with the thing that I'm fighting for, right? And I'm not feeling it, So they'll all, once you kind of like, there's an in for everybody. It's not, you don't want to get possessed by it. You don't want to stay possessed by it, which a lot of people do. But you want to dive into the point of energy that you've been given. And it's usually a result of your trauma. And your trauma will be trauma because it hits you in your most sensitive, talented spot. Otherwise it wouldn't hurt.
Yeah.
It got you right in your genius, right? I guarantee you. Okay, no guarantees. But that's so common, in that place, where the cave that you've most feared to enter is where your treasure lies, says Campbell. And that's really true, and it will lead you to all the others, So I'm going to do magician probably first all the time. And that's going to be my access point to this whole energetic world of archetype. And then the others, I put peace and alchemize and constellate in myself.
Yeah, and I feel like the king as well. Like if you're occupying king archetype energy, there is a need and an understanding of your assets and your skills in order to give the blessing. And so that's also like a really easy in to be like, okay, I need some more big picture, or I need some feet on the ground, or I need some connection. Cool.
Well, in mythopoetic men's work, they really focus on king because they figure that when you have the king, the others constellate around the king.
Yeah,
I see that a little differently. I think that's masculine dominated and thinking, but it is interesting.
Well, my thought would be that the lover connects people the way that the king constellates people.
Yeah.
So they kind of play off each other like that too.
Yeah, they really do. So there's an endless game here of playing with these archetypes. And
speaking of endless.
All right, we'll be done today. But I love this conversation.
Well, I want to come back. I want to close with this.
Please.
We talked about God a couple episodes ago, and you talked about somebody saying they had a God-sized hole in their heart, and I feel like archetype is an answer to that. That we can notice that longing, notice the places where there's something that feels like it's missing, and we can use archetype. And when we're aware of it, then even in our projections and our interactions with other people, we actually start to develop that from within. So
start filling that hole.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and that's a self-sourcing of our divinity. That's really interesting. Archetype is a pathway to self-sourcing our connection with our own divinity. Fascinating. Beautiful.
Thanks for joining us. It was a really fun discussion on lover and magician, and appreciate your attention. And we would love if you would like and share and subscribe and join us, be a part of our conversation. You can find more info on these archetypes on our website, soulandspiritwellness.com. If you go to Energy Gym, we've done a 90-minute episode on each of these with some helpful energetic practices and tools so that you can integrate these archetypes.